The silence of the ridge is not a quiet thing. It's a heavy, pressurized weight. At 2 a.m., the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a wooden lung, expanding and contracting with the mountain wind. I sat in the armchair, the amber glow of a single lamp failing to reach the corners of the living room. The first sound was a rhythmic tick-tick-tick. I didn't look up from my book. Old cedar settles when the temperature drops, complaining as the joints contract. But then came a soft thud. It wasn't the sharp crack of wood. It was muffled, like a heavy book dropped onto a thick rug. It came from directly beneath my feet. I froze. The house was built on a concrete crawl space, barely 2 feet high, hardly enough room for a stray dog, let alone anything larger. I waited, my breath hitching in the back of my throat. The silence returned, thicker than before, until a long, slow, rasping sound traveled across the floorboards from the hearth toward my chair. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It sounded like bone on dry timber. "Just a raccoon," I whispered. My voice sounded thin and alien in the dark. I stood up, the floorboards groaning under my weight. To prove my own bravery, I walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I stepped, I heard a faint answering vibration. Every time my heel hit the wood, there was a secondary, softer impact from below, a microscopic delay, like an echo that didn't know its place. I stopped. The silence stopped. I took a long, deliberate stride toward the sink. Thump, shh. The sound from below was identical, a heavy weight dragging itself to keep pace with me. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. A draft smelling of wet earth and ancient dust seemed to rise through the microscopic gaps in the floor. I didn't get the water. I turned to head back to the bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I moved faster now. Below me, the scratching intensified. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was frantic. It sounded like dozens of long, needle-thin fingers scrambling against the underside of the planks, desperate to stay beneath my shadow. I reached the hallway and stopped abruptly. The scratching continued for a split second before cutting off with a sharp, violent snap. Then, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The crawl space was concrete. There were no gaps, no hollow voids deep enough for that kind of movement. The sound wasn't coming from under the house. It was coming from inside the floor. The joists, the narrow spaces between the subfloor and the finish, something was flattened within the very structure of the building, sliding through the architecture like grease. I backed into the bedroom, my eyes fixed on the floorboards in the hallway. In the dim light, I saw a single floorboard flex upward, just a millimeter. Then the one next to it. Something was pacing me from within the wood. I stood in the center of the bedroom, paralyzed. The silence was absolute now, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. I lifted my right foot. From directly beneath my left foot, the one still planted, came the sound of a heavy boot hitting wood. Thump. I gasped and shifted my weight. Before my foot even touched the floor, the sound of a footfall rose to meet it from the floorboards. It wasn't mimicking me anymore. It was anticipating me. It knew where I was going to step before I did. I was standing on top of a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I felt a vibration begin. A low, rhythmic humming started beneath my heels, vibrating up through my bones. It felt like a predator purring. I looked down, my vision blurring with tears of pure primal terror. The sound moved. It didn't slide toward the door or the walls. It focused. The scratching started again, right between my feet. But this time it wasn't muffled by the wood. It was sharper, clearer. The floorboard directly between my toes didn't just creak, it splintered. A long, pale sliver of something that looked like a fingernail, but as thin and gray as a moth's wing, poked through the crack. It didn't reach for my feet, it retreated. The sound of the scratching didn't move away, it moved up. I heard the dry, papery rustle transition from the floor into the hollow base of the nightstand, and then, with a horrific wet click, into the air of the room behind me. The final sound wasn't a knock or a scratch. It was the sound of a long, rattling breath being drawn, not from the floor, but from 2 inches behind my right ear. The silence in the woods isn't actually silent. It's a heavy, pressurized thing that pushes against the eardrums until you start hearing the rhythm of your own pulse. I sat at the small pine table, the amber glow of a single kerosene lamp fighting a losing battle against the shadows of the cabin. Outside, the Seolcote tree line was a jagged black wall against a moonless sky. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window over the sink. It's an old pane, wavy and thick with age, set into a frame that groans whenever the wind sighs. At night, it doesn't function as a window at all. It's a black mirror reflecting the cramped interior of the kitchen back at me. It started with the lamp. I reached out to turn the wick down, my hand casting a long, flickering shadow. In the reflection, my hand moved, but the shadow it cast on the reflected wall stayed still for a heartbeat longer than it should have. I froze. I stared at the glass. My reflection stared back, hand outstretched, perfectly mimicked. Just the flicker, I told myself, the brain playing tricks in the low light. I stood up to get a glass of water, keeping my back to the glass. The air in the cabin felt suddenly cold, the kind of cold that starts in the marrow. As the water ran, I couldn't help it. I looked. In the reflection, I was still sitting at the table. My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest. I was standing at the sink. I could feel the cold vibration of the pipes in my palm. But in the dark glass, I was still seated, turning a page of a book I wasn't holding anymore. I watched my seated self for 3 seconds. Then the reflection stood up, mimicked my movement toward the sink, and caught up to reality. I shut the tap off. The sound of the dripping water felt like a hammer on an anvil. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because in the reflection, behind my shoulder, the cabin door was standing wide open. I looked at the real door, visible in my peripheral vision. It was bolted, latched, solid. I looked back at the glass. The reflected door was open to the hungry black of the forest, and something was standing in the door frame. It wasn't a monster, it was a shape, a tall, spindly distortion of a person draped in a coat that looked like wet soot. It didn't have a face, just a suggestion of features stretched tight over a skull. I spun around, my chair screeching against the floorboards. The door was shut. The cabin was empty. The only sound was the frantic, wet thudding of my heart. "It's the glass," I whispered, my voice sounding like dry paper. "The lead in the glass. Refraction. It's a delay." I forced myself to walk toward the window, my legs heavy as if wading through deep water. I wanted to cover it, to hang a towel over that wretched pane. But the closer I got, the more the reflection changed. The figure in the reflection wasn't at the door anymore. It was directly behind me. In the glass, a long gray hand was reaching out, its fingers hovering inches from the back of my neck. I felt the heat of my own skin, the prickle of goosebumps, but I felt no cold touch. I turned again, a frantic 360-degree spin. Nothing, just the smell of old wood and the dying kerosene. I turned back to the window, and this time the reflection didn't wait for me. My reflection was leaning against the sink, smiling. It wasn't my smile. It was too wide, showing too many teeth,
the eyes bright with a predatory intelligence that I didn't possess. The me in the glass raised a hand and tapped on the inside of the window, the side I was standing on. Tap, tap, tap. I felt the vibration under my own fingertips, but I wasn't moving. I was paralyzed, a spectator in my own body. Then the realization hit me like a physical blow. The reflection wasn't behind, it was ahead. The creature in the glass grabbed the me in the reflection by the throat. I watched myself struggle, watched my face turn a bruised purple, my eyes bulging. I felt my own throat constrict, air escaping me in a useless whistle, though no hand touched my skin. I was experiencing the effect without the cause. The creature in the glass leaned in close to my reflection's ear, its jaw unhinging. It whispered something. In the real world, my mouth opened. I didn't command it. My lungs filled with air I didn't draw. "Let me in," my own voice said, but the timbre was wrong, hollow, echoing, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. I watched the reflection of myself reach out and grab the edges of the window frame. In the glass, I was pulling myself forward, stepping into the kitchen. In the real world, I felt my heels lift up. I felt my body being pulled backward toward the dark glass, as if the vacuum of the forest was sucking me in. I tried to scream, but my reflection had already stopped screaming, so I remained silent. I saw my reflection's foot step out of the frame and onto the real floor of the cabin. It looked solid. It looked more real than I felt. As he stepped out, I felt myself becoming translucent, the colors of my flannel shirt fading into the grayscale of the reflection. The creature behind me in the glass let go of my throat. I fell back, not onto the floor, but into the cold, hard depth of the glass. The glass didn't break. It rippled like water. I am standing in the kitchen now. I can see the kerosene lamp, the pine table, and the book. But the lamp doesn't give off warmth, and the book has no words on the pages. On the other side of the glass, he is standing there. He looks exactly like me. He picked up the glass of water I dropped and drank it. He looked at the window, at me, and his eyes were cold and vacant. He didn't see a monster. He just saw a reflection he didn't like. He reached out and closed the wooden shutter, locking it with a firm click. Now there is only the dark, and I am the one waiting for someone to look in.
The air in the embassy suites was heavy, filtered through an industrial HVAC system that hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. It was 11 p.m. Outside, a thick, unnatural fog had swallowed the city, erasing the ground below and the sky above, leaving my fifth-floor suite floating in a gray, oppressive void. The evening had been a ritual of decompression, a mindless movie, the sharp herbal scent of a joint on the balcony, and the slow unraveling of my nerves after a day of corporate posturing. I felt heavy, my limbs sinking into the starch-white linens of the king-sized bed. I was drifting, that hazy borderland where thoughts become fluid, when the first sound fractured the silence. Thwack! It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of wet meat hitting glass. I froze. My breath hitched, caught in the back of my throat like a physical obstruction. I told myself it was the wind, or perhaps a bird lost in the soup of the fog. Then it happened again. Thwack! 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 Rhythmic, deliberate, heavy. My heart didn't just beat, it slammed against my ribs, a trapped animal trying to kick its way out. I was 5 stories up. There were no ledges, no fire escapes, just a sheer drop into the mist. Logic screamed that the balcony was empty, but my skin crawled with a primal evolutionary certainty. I was being watched. I rose from the bed, my feet hitting the cold carpet. I felt like a spectator in my own body, watching myself move toward the heavy blackout curtains.
The silence in the room was now deafening, amplified by the absence of the hum I'd grown used to. The HVAC had cut out. The air felt thin, smelling faintly of stagnant water and something metallic. I reached out. My fingers brushed the polyester fabric of the curtain, and a jolt of static electricity snapped against my skin. In that exact microsecond, the sound of the sliding glass door grinding on its tracks echoed through the suite. Screech! I ripped the curtain back. He was right there, inches away. A man stood on the other side of the glass, bathed in the sickly green glow of the hotel's emergency exit sign. He was disheveled, his suit jacket was torn at the shoulder, and his white shirt was translucent with moisture. But it was his face that rooted me to the floor. His skin was the color of a bruise, waxy and tight, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, rimmed with a raw, weeping red. My mind fractured into 1,000 panicked fragments. I saw my own obituary. I saw my mother crying over a closed casket. I thought of Alice, how I'd never told her that I kept the receipt from our first date in my wallet. I was looking at my death, standing on a balcony that should have been impossible to reach. "Holy fucking shit!" I screamed, the sound tearing from my lungs, raw and jagged. The man didn't flinch, he didn't lunge, he just stood there, his hands pressed flat against the glass. His fingernails were broken, dark lines of dried blood under the beds. He leaned in closer, his breath fogging the pain in a slow, rhythmic circle. "I am so sorry to alarm you," he said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a polite, melodic baritone that didn't match the wreckage of his appearance. "My wife and we've locked ourselves out on the adjacent balcony. The door jammed. Could you please call the front desk?" The mundane request hit me like a physical blow. The adrenaline, having no outlet, turned into a sickening nausea. I looked past him. The fog was so thick I couldn't even see the railing of the next balcony over. Yes, just a second," I stammered, my hand shaking so violently I had to grip my wrist. I backed away, never taking my eyes off him. I reached for the bedside phone, my palms slick with cold sweat. I dialed 0. "Front desk?" a tired voice answered. "There's a man," I whispered, staring at the figure through the glass. He was still smiling, a thin, practiced stretch of the lips. "He's locked out on the balcony of 504. He needs help." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. "Sir?" the receptionist said, her tone shifting from bored to sharply concerned. "That's not possible." "He's standing right here," I hissed. "He says he's with his wife." "Sir," the voice came back, dropping to a low, trembling register. "Please listen to me very carefully. Do not open that door. Room 504 is a storage suite. It hasn't been occupied in 3 years. And sir, the Embassy Suites doesn't have balconies on the 5th floor." A cold, dead weight dropped in my stomach. I looked back at the glass. The man was still there, smiling. But as the fog shifted behind him, I realized what I had missed in my terror. There was no floor beneath his feet. He wasn't standing on a balcony. He was suspended in the empty air 5 stories above the concrete, his fingers hooked into the narrow decorative molding of the building like a gargoyle. Then he leaned his head to the side, his neck cracking with the sound of dry wood snapping. "She's coming now," he whispered through the glass. Behind him, out of the swirling gray abyss of the fog, another hand reached out. A pale, bloated hand, dripping with river water, gripped the edge of my sliding door. I didn't scream this time. I couldn't. I simply watched as the glass began to slide open from the outside.
The silence of my apartment at 3 a.m. isn't actually silent. It's a heavy, pressurized thing. a composite of the refrigerator's rhythmic hum, the settling of floorboards, and the white noise of my own pulse. I was sitting in my armchair, the only light coming from the amber glow of a dying scented candle, when the world decided to break. The television didn't just turn on, it screamed to life. A wall of jagged, monochromatic noise exploded into the room, flooding the walls with a frantic, rhythmic flickering. It was a 50-inch window into a blizzard. I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The remote was on the coffee table, 3 feet away. I hadn't touched it. "Great," I whispered, the sound of my own voice thin and hollow against the roar of the static. I reached for the remote and pressed the power button. Nothing. I pressed it again, harder, the plastic creaking under my thumb. The screen remained a chaotic dance of black and white grains. The air in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees instantly. I could see my breath, a faint puff of mist illuminated by the strobe light effect of the display. I leaned forward to manually hit the switch on the side of the frame, but I stopped. There was something in the grain. At first, I thought it was just the way my eyes were processing the rapid movement, a persistence of vision trick. But as I stared, a shape began to coalesce. It was a vertical smudge, darker than the surrounding gray, centered in the middle of the screen. It was human-shaped, but wrong. The limbs were slightly too long, the shoulders peaked at sharp, unnatural angles. It looked like a silhouette caught in a heavy fog, or a ghost trying to push through a sheet of ice. I shifted to the left, trying to get a better angle to see if it was just a burn-in on the OLED. The shadow shifted with me. A cold prickle of sweat broke across my forehead. I moved back to the right, slowly, my eyes locked on the screen. The figure in the static mirrored my movement with a fluid, terrifying grace. It didn't just move, it glided, and it was closer now. The camera angle of the static, if such a thing existed, seemed to be zooming in. The figure was no longer a distant smudge. I could see the suggestion of fingers, long and needle-thin, pressed against the inside of the glass. "Just a glitch," I muttered, though my lungs felt like they were collapsing. Just a reflection of the signal. But there was no signal. The cable box was off. The router was dark. I stood up, intent on pulling the plug from the wall. As I rose, the figure in the static rose with me. It was so clear now that I could see the static swirling around it, as if the shadow were a solid object displacing the noise. It was inches from the front of the screen. It had no face, only a smooth, void-like surface where features should be, but I felt its gaze. It was a heavy, predatory weight that made the hair on my neck stand straight up. I lunged for the power cord behind the TV stand, yanking it with such force that the lamp nearby toppled over. The plug hissed as it left the socket, a stray spark biting my thumb. The TV didn't turn off. The static grew louder, a wet grinding sound like teeth on bone. The flickering light became violent, casting long, jerky shadows across my living room. I backed away, tripping over the fallen lamp, my eyes never leaving the screen. That's when the realization hit me, cold and final. The TV screen was glass. It was dark. It was reflective. I wasn't looking at a figure inside the television. I was looking at a reflection. The shadow wasn't in the static, it was behind me. I froze. Every muscle in my body turned to lead. The heat of my own body seemed to be sucked out of my skin, replaced by a tomb-like chill. I could feel a presence, a density in the air just inches from the back of my skull. It didn't breathe. It didn't smell like anything. It was just an absence of space, a hole in the world standing right there. Slowly, agonizingly, I turned my head back toward the TV. The screen went pitch black. For one heartbeat, the room was plunged into total, suffocating darkness. Then the static returned. But it was different. It was dim, a muted gray wash that provided just enough light to see the image on the screen. The TV was showing me the room. It was showing me from the perspective of the TV stand. I saw the armchair. I saw the tipped-over lamp. I saw myself, huddled on the floor, my face pale and distorted by terror. And I saw the thing standing behind me. It was 7 feet tall, a spindly, charcoal black entity that leaned over my shoulder. Its long, translucent fingers were hovering just millimeters away from my hair. It had no eyes, but its head was tilted at an inquisitive, sickening angle, as if it were studying a bug it intended to crush. I tried to scream, but my throat was a desert. I tried to bolt, but my legs were gone. The TV screen flickered one last time, a bright, blinding flash of pure white. Then it clicked. The static vanished. The screen went dead. The roar of the noise was replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like I'd gone deaf. I sat there in the dark, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against the floorboards. The room was empty. The television was just a hunk of plastic and glass, disconnected from the wall. "It's gone," I whispered, the words trembling. "It was a hallucination, sleep deprivation. It's gone." I reached out a hand to steady myself against the armchair, ready to stand up and run for the front door, run until the sun came up. But as my hand moved through the air, I didn't feel the velvet of the chair. I felt something cold, something dry and textured like old parchment. And then, in the absolute darkness of the room, 5 long, needle-thin fingers closed gently around